Hello, everyone. My name is Christy Kirkland, and I work with a Partnership for Inclusive Innovation, a statewide public-private partnership that works to spur innovation across Georgia and beyond. I am very excited today to be hosting this Smarter Together webinar session on the topic of 5G infrastructure risk. Before we get started today, I just have a few housekeeping notes. The session today will be recorded and will be posted to our website, pengeorgia.org, later today if you need to refer back to it. Also today, due to time constraints, we won't be having an open Q&A at the end, but if you do have questions, feel free to post them in the chat function, and we will be giving those questions to our speakers, and they will do their best to reach back out to you with answers. Also for attendees, if you would, please keep yourself muted and your video off. So with that, I'd like to hand the webinar over to Delana Hill from Cybersecurity and Infrastructure Security Agency, part of the Department of Homeland Security.
Hi, everyone. Yes, my name's Delana. I represent CISA, and today I will be talking about CISA's roles in 5G. Next slide. The 5G generation of wireless network, or commonly known as 5G, represents a complete transformation of telecommunication network, introducing a wealth of benefits that will pave the way for new capabilities in support of connectivity for applications like smart cities, autonomous vehicles, remote health, and so much more. CISA, through the National Management Center, is leading the risk mitigation efforts for working with government and industry partners to ensure this security and resilience of 5G technology and infrastructure. CISA's 5G strategic initiatives were developed in line with CISA's vision for 5G connectivity that enhances national security, technological innovation, creates economic opportunities, and mission to lead 5G's risk management efforts to promote deployment of security and resilient 5G. CISA's core competencies also play a role in development of strategic initiatives to ensure there are policy, legal, security, and safety framework in place to fully leverage 5G's technology while managing its significant risks. These competencies include risk management, stakeholder engagement, and technical assistance. Next slide, please. While 5G provides many new capabilities and services, it's also introduced significant risks that threat national security, economic security, and other global interests. CISA has identified several risks, which include attempt by threat actors to influence and design architecture of 5G's network, limit competition in 5G's marketplace, resulting in more than proprietary solutions and untrusted vendors, susceptibility of 5G supply chain due to the malicious actors and endeavors, introduction to vulnerabilities. 5G technology potentially increases the attack surfaces for malicious actors by introducing new vulnerabilities. And lastly, currently 5G deploys leverage of latency infrastructure and untrusted components with known vulnerabilities. Next slide, please. The implication of these threats, if left unaddressed, could be very detrimental to our national security and technological innovation. Limit competition, forcing the consumers to adapt to untrusted technology, and increasing overall life cycle costs. Compromise 5G supply chain, reduction of security and control, components of flaws introducing by manufacturers' process and maintenance of procedures, and interface with non-critical communication, which would cause a negative impact on our critical communication network. Next slide, please. With that being said, we took a deep dive and would like to provide mitigation. There are opportunities for the United States government and industry to work together to maximize benefits of next generation communication networks and promote security and resilience associated with emerging 5G technologies. The United States and allied countries are advanced risk mitigation efforts that may be more difficult to address for deployment of 5G networks by advancing and encouraging trusted deployments, encouraging and continuing trusted development with next generation communication technologies, promoting international standards and processes, limiting the use of 5G's equipment with known vulnerabilities, and continuing to engage with private sectors. CISA wants to ensure a robust security capabilities for 5G application and services. Next slide, please. Partnering with government, private sectors, and academia are critical to ensure security and resilience of 5G deployment. Here are a few ways CISA engages with our partners. Through government, CISA partners with federal, state, local, and tribal and territorial government agencies to share and assess potential risks posed by 5G technology and to discuss specific policies, technological innovation, and legal implication to security of 5G deployment. Private sector, CISA relies on partners within the industry and private sectors to understand and manage the risks posed to 5G technology and ensure security is prioritized in the design and development of 5G technology. Academia, CISA partners with national labs and technology centers to support, analyze, and design testings and develop a 5G capability that addresses 5G security and vulnerability challenges associated with 5G's handset, radio access networks, and other 5G components. For example, CISA recently partnered with the Critical Infrastructure Resilience Institution, CIRES, also known as CIRES, and works with the Autonomous Vehicle Program. Next slide, please. Below is a current list of CISA's latest resources. To access these resources, please visit www.cisa.gov/5G. Thank you all for tuning in. To access these products and future products will be posted on that page. Now, with that being said, I would like to hand it over to Dr. Iris from Georgia Institute of Technology. Thank you all.
Thank you so much. I'll go ahead and start sharing my slides. All right, so hopefully y'all can see that well. What I wanted to start with is in the partnerships between CISA and academia. Delana Hill mentioned the Critical Infrastructure Resilience Institute. And so CIRI has several projects within this space that look at 5G and cybersecurity risks. And the one that I'm leading as part of CIRI and working with CISA is this project looking at characterizing end-to-end risk of the telecommunication supply chain. So that'll be the project that I do a deeper dive into today to talk about 5G risks. So today I'm going to be talking about 5G infrastructure risk, looking at assessing emerging 5G risks, as well as looking beyond just 5G and looking at the interdependent infrastructure risks that accompany that, including quantifying smart transportation systems. So I'll start with the motivation behind this work, which is looking at emerging risks from 5G and particularly connected critical infrastructure systems and functions. I'll talk about the main advances of our work and then talk about the application space. So as was previously mentioned, autonomous vehicles is definitely one of the big applications of 5G moving forward. And so we were interested in looking at risks of 5G and how that might impact connected and automated vehicle systems and smart transportation infrastructure systems. So I'll talk about that application space that we're looking at. I'll discuss the developed analysis methodology that we've done from a research standpoint in terms of a way to analyze the risk space and the risk scenarios within this landscape. Give some results that we've been able to obtain that assess quantitative impacts of varying risk scenarios on connected and automated vehicles, as well as the smart transportation system. And then finally, I'll end with work that we're doing related to risk mitigation and other partnerships and collaborations that we're looking at moving forward. So the main motivation behind this work is that telecommunications is increasingly connected to critical infrastructures. And so many critical infrastructure systems and functions rely on telecommunications and increasingly 5G for different asset monitoring, automation, and control activities. So you can imagine varying smart systems that might be increasingly connected, and then especially with the increasing capabilities of 5G, that 5G might be relied on more and more for some of these infrastructure functions. So for example, telecommunications is connected to many different sectors. And today we're going to be looking specifically at the transportation sector. So with these increased connectivity, there's definitely new capabilities that are really exciting to think about in terms of what we're able to do from a critical infrastructure standpoint. But at the same time, it's also introducing new risks, which are really important to think about as we look to secure our systems and make sure that they function under varying scenarios, as well as continue to function under potential targeted attacks or other risk scenarios. So what we wanted to do is to create a way and an ability to comprehensively analyze these risks. So what we did was to create a framework to be able to quantify the impacts of these risks so that we're able to compare different risk elements, as well as evaluate the impacts of telecommunication risks on connected critical infrastructure functions. So what we want to do here is look beyond just telecom or just 5G and understand the risks on interdependent infrastructure systems. So as we know, a lot of these systems are increasingly connected, they're increasingly dependent on each other. So really to understand the full risk landscape, it's really important to be able to understand the risks across this interdependent infrastructure system ecosystem. So there's two main advances of the work that I wanted to talk about. So the first is so looking at the current state of the art versus the new advances of the research. The first is that there are actually a lot of initiatives going on right now that look at risk assessment of 5G. In many cases, these are qualitative assessments of risk. So they provide, for example, lists of risk factors or risk vectors. And what we really wanted to do was to turn those qualitative assessments of risk into a quantitative assessment. And so rather than, for example, just having a list of risk elements, we wanted to be able to provide quantitative measures of risk impacts. And one of the reasons for doing that is we want to be able to actually compare across different risk factors. And so we want to say which risk factors might be more important, more significant in terms of mitigation. So being able to provide a quantitative measure of risk impacts is one of our objectives, and be able to compare across and really even prioritize different risk factors based off of those quantitative measures. And so the outcome from this work are quantitative measures of risk impacts. And the second main advance is looking at, instead of focusing solely on the telecommunication system and associated risks, what we wanted to do was really expand that scope and look at the impacts of telecommunications, and specifically 5G risk, on these connected and interdependent critical infrastructure functions. And so really to expand beyond just the telecom system and looking at the connections between telecom and other critical infrastructure functions. So the specific application space that we're looking at and that I'll talk about today is within the transportation system. And so we're looking at connected and automated vehicles. Here I'm calling them CAVs, also thinking of them as autonomous vehicles, and looking at smart transportation infrastructure and seeing how we might be able to assess risks within this application space. So this is definitely growing and a pretty high stakes application of 5G technology in terms of safety, driver safety, as well as network performance. And so in this landscape, it's essential to be able to evaluate the consequences of a potential failure or attack on the telecommunication system on these interdependent systems. And the outcomes from this work will be quantitative impacts of varying 5G risks on transportation systems and functions. And so I'll be showing towards the end here examples of what those outcomes are. So now let me move to the analysis methodology that we've developed as part of this project. And so the goal here is to be able to quantify impacts of 5G risks on both safety and network performance. And this is work that is currently under review within the Journal of Risk and Uncertainty in Engineering Systems. And so the analysis methodology that we've developed is looking at simulating different telecommunication system failure scenarios and then analyzing the interdependent impacts on the transportation system. The outputs that we're looking at quantify then the severity of impacts, and that will enable us to compare across multiple risk scenarios. So there's four main quantitative measures that we're looking at. The first two here, time loss and stop time, refer to network performance. And so time loss is the amount of time that's added to a vehicle's trip from driving below the ideal speed limit. So this is if there's a risk scenario that happens, there's some disruption to the 5G network, we might expect that there's going to be some impact downstream to the transportation network. And so time loss is a way to measure how much additional time is being taken on the network, so how much time is lost. And stop time is the amount of time that's spent completely stopped on the road throughout the trip. And so this is another measure of network performance in terms of how much increased time vehicles are spent stopped rather than flowing through the network. The number of collisions is something else that we wanted to track in terms of a safety measure, in terms of being able to measure these more critical impacts in terms of driver safety and number of collisions on the network. And then overall, a measure of network performance we have is number of vehicles affected, which can be increase in time loss, stop time, or involvement in a collision. And through all these analyses, so I'm going to talk about different risk scenarios that we've looked at. We want to compare the outcomes from those risk scenarios with a default scenario, which is everything is fine, there's no failure or attack. What are the outcomes from that scenario? So we'll be able to compare across a default scenario and an attack or failure scenario. To go into a little bit more detail about the methodology, so I'm going to show the workflow that we've developed for simulations and analysis. And in these simulations, we were really integrating 5G network parameters with transportation network parameters. So we start with the map of an area. So we've so far looked at part of downtown Atlanta as our case study. We have a map that we can input, and it creates a network of the area. So this includes the roads, intersections, speed limits, lights, things like that. And then we can input parameters that define the characteristics of the routes of the vehicles in the scenario, as well as we input parameters that define the vehicle to vehicle, as well as vehicle to infrastructure 5G communication. I'll talk in a second about the different elements of the network and the system that we're including, but here we're defining the parameters that govern all of that communication, and 5G is used for both the vehicle to vehicle as well as vehicle to infrastructure communication. Next, we can input a parameter change that simulates an attack or a malfunction event. And then lastly, then we'll have outputs indicating different vehicle positions, speeds, collisions, and congestion. And so that middle box there about parameter change simulating an attack or malfunction event would be the case where we can adjust our different parameters for different risk scenarios, and we can see the effects through the whole network, looking across the system at individual vehicles as well as overall system performance. Let me talk about some of the specific simulation parameters that we're inputting. So for the results that I'm going to show today, we did a 1,000-second long simulation. Step size is 1 second long, and we have a scenario where we have 50% automated and 50% non-automated vehicles. So this is simulating a scenario that's relatively near in the future in terms of having this mix of automation and non-automated vehicles. And we can change that mix as things develop and as we get more information about how autonomous vehicles are being integrated into the network. We have these different elements. So we have individual vehicles, we have roadside units, and then we have the server. And I'll go into a little bit more detail about each of those elements. The idea here is that vehicles periodically broadcast messages, and these are cooperative awareness messages, and they contain information about themselves as well as sensor data about their surroundings to other vehicles, and also the roadside units, which are within range. So roadside units, you can imagine as the units that are placed on the side of the road that are receiving information from vehicles, but they can also communicate to other vehicles. And then the other vehicles in the area can react appropriately to this information. The roadside units, or the RSUs, then forward the gathered information to a server, represented by the cloud there on the figure on the right, and that has a larger overview of the network. And the server can send messages, for example, these decentralized environmental notification messages to vehicles about, for example, hazardous conditions or traffic in their vicinity. So this is the overall system that we're looking at. We have these different sensors, these different ways to communicate between different elements of the system, and we're including all of this within our analysis. There's two main types of messages that we're including in the analysis. The first are these CAMs, these cooperative awareness messages. So this contains information about vehicle location, speed, acceleration, direction, and type, and size. And then the messages are sent to all the vehicles, only the ones obviously with communication capabilities. So the non-automated vehicles wouldn't be able to receive these, but all the vehicles with automation capabilities would receive these messages, and also the roadside units would receive them within the sender's broadcast range. And then the second main type of messages that we're looking at are these decentralized environmental notification messages, which contain information about hazardous road conditions, such as fog, ice, other obstacles, or different traffic conditions that might be unusual. These environmental messages transmit the type of hazards and the locations that the vehicles that are within the radius of that hazard can be informed. Driver is notified, and then the vehicle can respond automatically either by rerouting, slowing down, or changing lanes. And so this is really looking across the system and looking at these environmental type hazards. Now let me talk about the 5G network parameters that we're inputting. So we input different uplink and downlink bit rates here. And so these are based off of previous studies looking at 5G network performance. And so we have latency values, reliability values, and different packet loss probabilities for vehicle communication applications. The roadside units are placed through the network. So right now, since this is really a forward-looking study in terms of anticipating what the risks might be, there's no specific guidelines about how you place these roadside units across the network. And the coverage of a single unit can depend on many different factors, such as the installation height. There's just sharp curves in the road that might affect line of sight, different characteristics of the landscape or the terrain that might affect the ability for an RSU to communicate. But in general, in urban areas, they can be placed relatively uniformly through the network, or specifically in areas with high vehicle density. So in this case, for our study, so we're looking at an urban area, we're looking at downtown Atlanta. We distributed the RSUs through the network at every intersection so that we can cover the whole network, and blocks are roughly about 100 meters by 100 meters. So we see that as a pretty realistic and practical way for the future installation of these roadside units or small cells through the network to cover the whole network and enable this communication between vehicles as well as between vehicles and infrastructure. In terms of vehicle automations, this is the vehicle element of the system. So we have 5G enabled vehicle automation. At the start of the simulation, we have distance sensors that detect distances with vehicles ahead. And then at every time step, there's these messages, these cooperative awareness messages that are broadcast to the vehicles and roadside units. And then there's also this emergency braking feature so that if the distance ahead to the vehicle decreases by a certain amount within a certain time, then it'll activate this emergency braking. The roadside units, as I said, they forward messages from the server out to any vehicles from within their range. And in several of the following scenarios that I'll talk about, roadside units forward information about hazardous conditions. And then finally, we have the server element of the system where we have this traffic management center, kind of a higher level server, and it has information about a wider network than the roadside units do. And it processes the information received from the roadside units and sends those environmental notification messages out to the roadside unit. The roadside unit can then send them out to the vehicles within the vicinity of the hazard. Because latency is increased, so latency is the time of delay between when a message is sent and when it's received. Because it's increased when the message travels from a vehicle to an RSU to the server and then all the way back, there's some efforts that have been made to do some of the prioritization of risks at the roadside units. And so that's some of the things that we can think about with the integration of 5G into these infrastructure applications. Latency is definitely one of the important ones, thinking about what does increased latency potentially mean over the system. Reliability is another aspect in terms of what if some of these messages are lost, or what if some of these messages are corrupted. Those are all different factors that are important to think about and take into account as we think about these 5G applications, especially as they interface with critical infrastructure. So here's a simulation of a visualization of the simulation. And so here is that area of downtown Atlanta that we're looking at. I'm going to go ahead and play the simulation here. In this case, each of these little squares are either a vehicle or a roadside unit. When they're red, they're sending a vehicle to either vehicle or vehicle to roadside unit message. When it's green, it's receiving a message. the animation here is showing at each time step what's happening, and the vehicles are moving through the network at each time step as well, moving from where they're starting from towards their destination. And so this continues through the whole duration of the simulation, and we can simulate then those communications between vehicles as well as between vehicles and infrastructure. And so these vehicles go through, they're constantly communicating. The autonomous vehicles are constantly communicating with the vehicles that are nearby, as well as with the roadside units, which are placed at those intersections. And so this is really a pretty detailed simulation that we're able to do and really look at an individual vehicle level in terms of what happens, as well as get metrics and values that cross the entire system. All right, so let me talk now about the default scenario and the outcomes that we are able to get. So in the default scenario, this is the no risk event scenario. There's 650 vehicles in the network that move through the network over the duration of this scenario. The outcomes that we get are going to be the distributions of outcomes over all the vehicles. And so we're time loss and stop time are two of the measures that I previously talked about. We're going to give those as a percentage of our total trip time. So this is an example of the outcome here. So on the left here, we have time loss. On the right, we have stop time. What this is showing is the actual time loss and stop time as a percentage of their total trip time for all the vehicles in the scenario. So we're getting a distribution over all of the vehicles. As an example for stop time, we see there's a big peak at 0. So this is pretty positive, a positive outcome here where there's a fair amount of vehicles that don't spend any of their time stopped within their travels. But then there's a peak around 40% as well. So there's a significant number of vehicles that also have 40%, for example, stop time. And we can have these measures that we can get from these graphs that give, for example, mean stop time, mean time loss. For example, for time loss, you see within this default scenario, we're in an urban area. There's a lot of vehicles here. So we have a mean time loss of about 70%. But as I said, there's still a fair amount of vehicles who are able to kind of flow through the network. But these are these quantitative measures that we can use then to compare against the outcomes from different risk scenarios. And so these will be our default scenario outcomes that will then be able to compare with our risk scenario outcomes. So let me talk about the specific risk scenarios that we're looking at. And so there's going to be 3 that I'm going to talk about today and give analysis results for these individual scenarios. And so first is we're going to look at jamming of messages from vehicles. And so this is going to be a case where it affects the vehicle itself. And I'm going to show results that where we vary the number of vehicles that have been affected. The second risk scenario that I'm going to talk about is these fake environmental messages. And so this is going to be affecting a roadside unit. And I'm going to look at how the results change if we vary the radius of our roadside unit. And then finally, I'm going to talk about a more kind of severe scenario where we're looking at forced sudden braking of a vehicle where it's affected through a roadside unit. And I'm going to vary the number of roadside units that are affected, and we can see how the results change. So I'm going to go through each of these risk scenarios in a little bit more detail and then present results for each of these different risk scenarios. There's clearly more risks that could exist, especially within 5G and in that interface, but these are 3 example ones that I'll be able to talk about today. So first, looking at the jamming of a message from a vehicle. So this is simulated by changing what's called the driver imperfection value and removing the vehicle's automation features. So we're jamming the messages, so we disable the vehicle's automation features. And the driver imperfection value is this idea that drivers of vehicles with these communication capabilities, V2X capabilities, so communicating between a vehicle and vehicle or vehicle and infrastructure, and drivers of these vehicles with these automated driving features have been found to have higher likelihoods of being inattentive and becoming distracted. And so making a mistake, for example, if automation fails, because drivers become overly reliant on the automated features of the vehicle. And so they're in this automated vehicle, but then the automation fails. And so the driver imperfection value, in general, it's a value that's represented by a sigma value, and it ranges from 0 to 1, with 0 representing perfect driving. And in this scenario here, we're increasing the driver imperfection value from 0.5 to 0.9 to capture this type of behavior. And so let me show you the risk scenario outcomes from this particular risk scenario. So here I'm showing 4 columns of results here. The first column is that default scenario. So those the top graph is the stop time. the bottom graph is the time loss on the default. So we have our original plots that I had previously shown, and then we have the outcomes if we have 1, 2, or 5 vehicles jammed. And so let me highlight a few of the takeaways from these plots. The first is we can look at the percentage of vehicles that have been affected in this risk scenario. So obviously in the default, that's going to be our default scenario. But then if we look at 1, 2, and 5 vehicles jammed, we see about 50% of the vehicles are affected. If we look at the plots on the top, they actually look pretty similar. But if we look into the numbers, there's actually 50% of the vehicles, half of the vehicles within the network have experienced either an increased time loss or an increased stop time. So there is some effect across the whole network. But we see that results affecting single, so we have this increase in vehicles affected, half of them are affected, even if just one vehicle is jammed within the network. And so we see that results affecting a single vehicle when we're comparing with the default scenario are noticeable, but the changes from 1 to 2 to 5 vehicles is actually pretty small. We don't see a big increase if more vehicles are affected. What we found is that it depends on which vehicles are jammed, and it's based off of the path of that vehicle through the network. So it's pretty specific to which vehicle is chosen and which one is affected. And so we see this result where even affecting a single vehicle will have some noticeable effect on the network. But it's a little bit tough to see exactly what the outcomes will be without knowing the properties of an individual vehicle. So what we wanted to look at next, and the other measures show less change in this scenario. So what we wanted to look at next was actually looking at scenarios that impact the roadside units. And so I'll show these in the upcoming analyses that then impact multiple vehicles, and then we'll see that they show larger effects across the network. So let me move to the second risk scenario, which is that fake environmental message scenario. So here we're expanding the risk from a single vehicle impact to impacting roadside units that impact multiple vehicles. And in this case, the server sends a fake environmental notification message out. And then the affected roadside units then alert vehicles that there's, for example, ice on the road at the roadside unit's location. And then vehicles that receive this fake message respond by slowing down. So this is the case where the previous risk scenario was a jamming scenario. You jam the messages from the vehicles. In this case, we can imagine a scenario where false messages are sent through the system, and then we have these outcomes across the vehicles that are affected by this message. So then we can look at the scenario outcomes, so similar plots as we had before, but we can see a big difference now. So this is varying the radius of the roadside unit that's affected. So on the left-hand side, we had our default graphs and numbers, so that's what we've seen before. And then we have the results for a roadside unit with the communication radius of 50 meters, 200 meters, and 400 meters. So as the radius increases, we're saying that the roadside unit can affect more and more vehicles. So we're going wider and wider out in terms of the number of vehicles that are affected by this fake message. And one thing that you can notice is that if we go the default and then the radius of 50-meter plots look relatively similar, but then if we go to the radius of 200 and 400-meter plots, it looks completely different. So we see all the values shift to these higher values. And so if we focus on these right plots here, we can see that both stop time and time loss, the vehicle outcomes shift to much higher values with much higher stop times, much higher time loss. So we really see this large change in distribution of our vehicle performance because of this risk scenario. And we can quantify these numbers here if we look at the mean time loss and the mean stop time here. So now we have our mean stop time is between 93 and 97% for these larger radius scenarios. And our mean time loss is from 97 to 99% there. So we increased our mean stop time from 36 to 38% up to 90+%. And the same thing with time loss went from 70% up to 97+%. So we see these really large increases in stop time and time loss for this particular risk scenario. And so we see that this larger radius affects many vehicles, and then the shapes and the values of the distribution completely changes. So this gives us specific information in terms of what the significance of the impacts are with this risk scenario. And then I'll draw your attention to some of these other quantitative results here. If we look at the vehicles with greater than 80% stop time or greater than 80% time loss. So we wanted to look at the vehicles that are affected the most. So you're a vehicle and you had a trip time that you expected, But if your stop time is greater than 80% of that trip time, that would be pretty significant. Or if your time loss is greater than 80% of your trip time, that would also be significant. So the number of vehicles in that extreme case where you're affected a lot goes from, let's say in the 50-meter radius scenario, 2.8% of the vehicles have greater than 80% stop time. In these larger radius scenarios, we have 75 or 83% of the vehicles have greater than 80% stop time. So it's a big increase. Same thing with greater than 80% time loss. We go from 35.9% up to 75, 83% increase, have time losses of greater than 80%. So we see a large increase, a significant impact here. And then finally, we have this last measure that I haven't talked about yet, but in this case, it comes into play, which is the number of vehicles that didn't enter the network. And so this is the case where there's vehicles that are wanting to take a trip during the simulation time. The network is so congested that the vehicle didn't even have the opportunity to start their trip. And so in these more significant cases with the radius of 200 and 400 meters, we see that 11% or up to 31% of the vehicles don't even have time to go into the network because the network became so congested under this particular risk scenario. So this is showing us that when we have potential false messages that affect roadside units that then affect many vehicles, we can have pretty significant impacts across the network in terms of individual vehicle impacts and as well as vehicles that aren't even able to enter the network because the congestion is so bad across the network. And finally, I wanted to talk about a risk scenario where we have now a safety issue with we have forced sudden braking of a vehicle. So we're going to affect this through a roadside unit again, where the idea is that when a vehicle passes through the range of an affected roadside unit, it's altered so that it brakes harshly and unexpectedly throughout the rest of its trip. And so this simulates a high risk scenario. So it's definitely a high risk case where a vehicle is forced to brake harshly when it reaches this velocity value. And it really is looking at the scenario where an attacker wants to cause a dangerous situation on the road. And so let me show you the risk scenario outcomes from this. And so here I'm showing the defaults again on the left, and then with 1, 2, or 3 roadside units affected. And you can see immediately from even just one roadside unit being affected that the distribution completely changes. The values completely shift to the right. And so this is really a more severe type of scenario. You can imagine if you're driving along and your vehicle is suddenly braking without any reason, that would potentially cause a pretty large safety and performance issue across the network. And it's definitely a severe case that is important to think about as we think about the risk scenario landscape. So we see with even just this one roadside unit being affected, we have increased increased values across all of our quantitative measures. So mean stop time and mean time loss increased a lot. Number of vehicles affected is significant. There's a large percentage of vehicles that have greater than 80% stop time and time loss. Also a lot of vehicles with greater than 95% stop time and time loss. And there's also a significant number of vehicles that don't enter the network. And so here we see the impact of even just a single roadside unit being affected is large. And there's significant increases across all the measures of these risk scenario impacts. And so what these outcomes are showing is it gives us a way to quantify what happens when these different risk scenarios happen. We're including both 5G and transportation network parameters, and we're looking at these quantitative measures across the network, including individual vehicles. We can look at the distribution across all of them, as well as these more system level measures where we're getting mean stop times and time losses, as well as vehicles affected. So now let me talk about ongoing work that we're doing in this space. And so what we've developed is this ability to assess quantitative impacts of varying risk scenarios of 5G on dependent critical infrastructure functions. We've looked specifically at transportation. And so what we are wanting to do and what we're doing now is using them to compare across different risk elements and risk scenarios with the idea that if we're able to quantify what the impacts are, we want to be able to formulate and prioritize different risk mitigation strategies to minimize the negative impacts of 5G risks. So we know that 5G is definitely a growing space. There's a lot of capability that it's introducing, but it's also really important to think about potential risks and potential negative impacts if 5G is compromised in any way, or if there's potential issues with 5G and the critical infrastructure that depends on 5G for operation. And so one of the keys here is that we want to be able to identify risks and take steps to mitigate these risks ahead of time before the event occurs. So as I was saying, this scenario that we're looking at is, there doesn't exist yet in terms of there's not this deployment at this level. But by doing these analyses now, our goal is to be able to identify and take steps to mitigate these risks ahead of time before the event occurs. And there's different partnerships and collaborations that we're looking to build and cultivate for this effort. So the first is using real system data in the analysis if and when it becomes available. And so this is the idea, is these systems are being built out right now, they're being deployed. And so if there's anyone on the call, for example, here with real system data that they would want to be able to analyze or incorporate into an analysis like that, we'd be happy to discuss that. And also looking at an actual city environment in terms of actual deployments of or planned deployments of these different types of infrastructure are all things that we would be able to incorporate. And then also expanding the research and development for other agencies and organizations to be able to utilize, to be able to assess and prioritize 5G infrastructure risks. And so our goal here is to be able to mitigate risks and protect end users and also these critical functions that are increasingly reliant on 5G for operations. And the idea being that if we can be able to comprehensively analyze these risks, actually have these quantitative outcomes for these risks, we can do a better job in terms of mitigating the risks and having better outcomes for end users, national security, other types of national critical functions. So with that, I want to acknowledge students who have worked on this project, Joseph, Kathy, and Paula Vargas, particularly Paula for the simulation analysis work. I want to acknowledge the Department of Homeland Security Award that's listed here. So this is awarded through the Critical Infrastructure Resilience Institute, and my contact information is here. And so I see certain questions in the chat. So if it's ones that are specific to the research study, I will actually be able to answer them now. So let me, I believe we do have some time to do that. So Christy, I'm going to go ahead and look through. I see some that are specific about the automated vehicles study. And so I will be able to answer those now. So I'll go ahead and do that. Okay, so the first question I see is about data about automated vehicles traffic accident. Yeah, so that's not information that we have right now just because of the deployment. It hasn't really been deployed within a normal city environment with other vehicles and things like that, but it's definitely data that we would want to incorporate as it becomes available, and that's part of the ongoing work in terms of using real system data and incorporating those into the analyses. There's a question about tied into Georgia Tech's smart campus efforts. So we haven't yet. It would be definitely something that we would be interested in looking at. We've been looking more at urban environments and more at the city scale rather than a campus scale, but that would be something that might be interesting to look at. If you, for example, are involved in it, feel free to reach out and we can maybe discuss how that might tie in to do a specific analysis of the smart campus efforts. Yeah, so that was Keith's question there. And then there's another question from Idris about including all types of vehicles, including trucks. So right now we just have passenger vehicles, but we could include trucks as well. We can specify different types of vehicles within the network, including trucks and buses and other types of vehicles. And then a question from Bob in terms of now as a 5G program for startups using 5G, and could it be a test site? Yeah, yeah, interesting. I think it's worth looking into in terms of having a test site. I think all of these, as these systems are being built out and deployed, I think there's really an opportunity to get ahead of some of these risks and do mitigation efforts. I know CISA is really focusing on mitigation and what we can do for mitigation and to decrease future risks and future negative impacts as we move forward. There's a question from Keith about IT security being looked at to prevent bad actors for entering commands to impact risks. So I think I can just speak at a high level about that. I know that there's a lot of working groups that are out there in terms of looking at security protocols, in working with industry to look at security protocols that are being developed from security protocols that are being developed from industry, from individual providers, as well as providing guidelines. I would say that the work that we're doing here, we're rather than looking at specific security protocols, we're looking more at a system level in terms of what are the impacts of potential compromised systems on the dependent functions. But I do know that for sure that there are a lot of efforts that are ongoing, and that might be a question that can be addressed after the end of the webinar in terms of some of the products that have come up in terms of IT security protocols that are, I know that there's working groups, for example, that are looking at those types of protocols. All right, I'll go ahead and stop sharing my screen. If there's any other questions, feel free to put it in the chat, and I'll go ahead and turn it back over to Christy.
Thank you so much, Iris. We really appreciate you and Delana speaking with us today. And we appreciate everyone for tuning in. We hope that you'll join us next week for our Smarter Together webinar on November 11th. And the topic is hydrogen, what's real, what's hype, and what's happening. So we hope to see you then. Hope everyone has a good day. Thank you so much.